Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Member for North Shropshire. Now, I contribute today as an ex-Shadow Fisheries Minister, as a member of the EFRA Select Committee, and as someone who grew up in Grimsby, as some people in this chamber already know. Now, as a girl, I remember a bustling fishing port. Not only that, it was the biggest in the world at that time. I remember the numerous trawlers in the port, in the docks, and the sense of pride on the part of workers doing something they knew was incredibly important, providing the nation with one of its favourite foods. But I also remember the decline that followed the so-called final cod war with Iceland. The devastation that it wreaked, both economically and socially, was vivid. And I was a teenager at the time, but I remember areas particularly around the docks, Freeman Street, the East Marsh, suffering disastrous consequences, something I'm sure my honourable friend will refer to later. Gone too are the many of the food processing plants that lined Ladysmith Road. Findus has gone. Bird's Eye has gone from Grimsby, no longer anchored by the town's status as one of the greatest food towns in Europe. It's my witness of this decline and the fact that my father was, for a period, a deep-sea fisherman, fishing off the coast of Iceland, fishing actually just off the coast at Reykjavik, that gives me an understanding of why our coastal towns and fishing communities matter more than their contribution to national GDP would suggest. I do want to pay tribute at this point quickly to all those who died serving the fishing industry. In Grimsby, every time a trawler went down, well, men were washed overboard, and that was the most common cause of death. The children in the town, in their primary schools every morning, would repeat the fisherman's prayer and sing the fisherman's hymn. And it was all too common, particularly in the 1950s, that those children would have to sing those hymns and say those prayers. Now, moving on to the actual bill before us, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have a number of concerns. First of all, the government's stated aspiration is to develop a world-leading fisheries, with clause 1 of the bill setting out how this would be developed, including objectives such as creating a sustainable industry. We'd all support that. Unfortunately, however, the light touch duties placed on the authorities undermines potentially how these aspirations will be delivered. For example, in the area of maximum sustainable yield, while the bill places an ambitious objective, quite rightly, to ensure that all harvested stocks are recovered to or maintained at biomass above that capable of producing MSY, the bill places no duty on regulatory authorities to ensure that fishing pressure is managed in order to deliver on this objective. We have to ask the question, therefore, is the government really committed to restoring stocks? Or will it put political pressures first, at the expense of the science and the data available? And there is a history here of those pressures leading to that kind of overexploitation of our stocks, not just in our waters, but across the waters of the European Union. Secondly, there are concerns in relation to our marine environmental regulations. The Fisheries White Paper acknowledges concerns about a possible governance gap, which could threaten accountability for the implementation of these regulations. It also suggested, alongside consultations which have taken place on the Environmental Principles and Governance Bill, that a new independent environmental regulator should have a role in relation to the marine environment. Now, as things currently stand, the bill before us is opaque on this point, in terms of how the forthcoming Environment Bill will protect our marine environment and how this governance gap will be closed. Clarifications, therefore, on these issues would be most welcome as the bill passes through its legislative process, and I hope that the Minister today will make comment on this when he winds up the debate. Clause 28 will give new powers to introduce financial schemes to promote sustainable growth and to improve the marine and aquatic environment. These powers will replace existing powers and allow new funding schemes to replace funding currently received under the European Maritime Fisheries Fund. However, As presently drafted, these grant-making powers do not reference Clause 1's sustainability objectives, such as an ecosystem-based approach, which for me seems rather strange and concerning, and again clarification would be welcomed. I understand that the fisheries statement will reference Clause 1 and that the powers will come under the remit of the statement, but clarification would be welcome. My final point relates to the very important fact that the fishing industry is not just about the catching side. There is still a very important processing and aquaculture industry alongside it, most of which, unsurprisingly, is based within or nearby fish landing towns, such as Grimsby, Immingham, the Humber. 21%, in fact, of the industry is in Yorkshire and the Humber. It is an important provider of jobs in those areas. Indeed, for my hometown of Grimsby, it is still an important source of employment, with some 4,200 jobs dependent on the sector. These processing plants also export much of their product into the European Union in a market worth £1.3 billion, where we still enjoy a trade surplus. It is therefore vital in the drive to create a world-leading fisheries that processing is not forgotten, and it has been in this debate so far today. This means full, tariff-free access to the single market must be retained for the industry. Anything else, such as a separate... I'll give way just once, because the time is ticking by.
Very brief. The Honourable is absolutely right about processing, and it also requires concentration for productivity, investment in technology, making sure our processing industry is competitive as it can be. And I hope during the course of the bill that can be debated and included in the government's objectives.
I don't disagree with the honourable gentleman. You know, in Grimsby, Grimsby makes some of the very best premium products in the world. And one of the local fish finger producing plants can take the fish from the moment it's landed at Immingham and have it in the lorry, go into the supermarket in 6 hours. And one of the reasons why it's possible to get that fish, in fact, from its moment of departure from Iceland to get into the shops, is absolutely concertinaed into a minimum. And do you know why? Because of the single market. That's the reason why that fish is as fresh as possible, and that's why those products are as good as they are, because of the way in which the single market has made it possible to ensure guaranteed standards, while at the same time maximising productivity. No, I'm not giving way anymore, I'm sorry, because there are a lot of people wishing to speak. Anything else in relation to a failure to secure access to the single market, such as a sacrifice of our access to that market in return for keeping access to our waters broadly to ourselves, will represent a betrayal and could potentially decimate processing in areas where the jobs and the economic activity it provides is vital. So I'm convinced that the processing side of the industry, 64% of the employment, by the way, in the sector is in processing, will not want to see its interests sacrificed on the grounds that we will not give any access or very limited access to our waters to foreign vessels. This brings me neatly to my closing remarks, Madam Deputy Speaker. We now have a withdrawal agreement on the table alongside the political statement, giving something of an indication of the direction of travel. This political statement, however, gives really only a faintest glimmer of what will happen after the transition period, and that's not really good enough, particularly as far as fisheries are concerned. That's right. It's also true that, like the Agriculture Bill, this legislation is enabling, and it contains a number of Henry VIII powers. Like others in this chamber, I worry about the use of this mechanism, given the lack of effective parliamentary scrutiny that accompanies the use of statutory instruments. I hope, therefore, that the Government will think more carefully about this bill and allow it to be amended to ensure it gives greater clarity on the direction of travel as far as our fishing industry is concerned.